energy and air pollution will be one of the top 5 issues for the general election.
We talk about Putin being in control. He's not really. It's the various factions under him, and it suits them to have him at the front.
If you're trying to save for a house deposit and you'd have to save up some crazy amount of money, how on earth are you going to do that if a pint is £7?
There's certain key things that we want from India and there's certain key things that they want from us.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Caroline Hepker.
Well, on today's programme, we're going to be talking a lot about COP28. It kicks off in Dubai, gathering world leaders from around the globe and also some people who'd like to be leaders. Labour's Keir Starmer is among the delegates attending. Don't forget, earlier this week, he had a meeting with the Greek Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, and Rishi Sunak cancelled his. It rather reminds me, Caroline, of Davos, when Sir Keir was schmoozing the global elite and Rishi Sunak stayed at home, seemingly nervous to be branded one of them. Do you reckon this could be part of Starmer's plan to look like a Prime Minister in waiting?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's part of his plan. It does raise that interesting debate that we had also with the Greek PM about, what is the role of the opposition leader when it comes to kind of foreign affairs, diplomatic relations. But look, when it comes to COP28, of course, King Charles is also in Dubai for a couple of days with meetings there. Obviously, someone who's been deeply involved in COP for a lot of years.
Should he be now he's the monarch?
Yes, again, sort of similar questions. But then there's also the big question mark around the COP28 president, Sultan Al Jaber, who's the CEO of Abu Dhabi National Oil, which is, the world's 12th largest oil company. I mean, I think there's a real debate about that and who sort of leads when it comes to global climate change. We have not done particularly well since the last COP a year ago. Yeah,
who remembers or who's seen what came out of Glasgow or Paris?
Yeah, I think that's true. But on the other hand, even people who are very sceptical about an oil executive leading COP28, I would just say one thing, from the industry perspective, there is a kind of realpolitik, and I use that word, thinking about, of course, Henry Kissinger, who died yesterday. This idea that you have to confront the world as it is and not as you would wish it to be. And I think the industry would say these big global organisations, corporations, oil majors indeed, also need to be at the heart of how we change kind of green policy. I know that the environmentalists will poo-poo that, but I do understand why there is also pushback that who is going to deliver the green change that we desperately need. Might not be happening quickly enough, but actually if you don't involve the corporations, how does it get done?
Well, I also have to ask myself whether having 70,000 people descend on Dubai via plane, presumably, is surely the best way to fix the planet. But on the point of Keir Starmer, It does seem like it would be a bit irresponsible if he didn't forge these relations with international leaders now, given the situation in the polls. And I was speaking to a senior Treasury civil servant yesterday who served New Labour, so no longer works in the Treasury, but they were saying that Blair and Brown were far more prepared for government back in 1997. They had the plans ready baked to go, and what's the phrase, oven ready to go, and actually that's just not the situation now with Labour.
Well, do you think so? I think that's interesting that you raised that conversation. 6 months ago I would have agreed with you. Now are we certain of that, and in 6 months' time will we be? I'm sure that Labour must be preparing for that.
That's what he said, but the Chancellor, of course, is desperate to see Labour's economic plans. He was in the Times yesterday baiting Labour, saying there's fundamental dishonesty in Labour's plan. They can't support Tory tax cuts, borrow an extra £20 billion a year and get debt falling. So are they going to cancel something or raise taxes? That's his question. I reckon, therefore, Keir Starmer is going to enjoy the more international focus in Dubai.
Yeah, maybe. Although, will he be in favour of, the Climate Mitigation Fund? That's the main talking point in COP28 about giving money to, perhaps from industrialised countries to developing countries, to try to mitigate, the climate issue. There's no size and scope, who's going to pay, etc. What would Labour's position on that be? Now, Nottingham City is the latest UK council to go bankrupt. The region declared a Section 114 notice yesterday evening, citing increased demand for children's and adult social care, rising homelessness and the impact of inflation as having put extra pressure on its finances. It's the latest local authority to run out of money after bankruptcies in Birmingham this year, which meant that six other councils which have gone bust since 2018. Now, Councillor Stephen Houghton is the chair of the Special Interest Group of Municipal Authorities. Its recent survey found that 30% of members risked issuing a Section 114 notice in the next 2 years. Welcome to the programme. Do you think this is random? Is this systematic underfunding? Is this mismanagement by the council in Nottingham City?
Obviously, I'm not in a position to look at the day-to-day accounts of Nottingham City, but what I can say is Nottingham, like every other council, is under severe financial pressure. One, because of the things you've already highlighted around children's and adults' social care, but secondly, because the system for funding local authorities is now generally accepted to be broken, and we need a new way of funding our local services.
So does that mean that local authorities can't be trusted to look after their own money?
No, what it means is local authorities have got massive demand pressures, particularly around children's and adults, but also elsewhere, whether it's homelessness, need to keep fixing the roads, need to keep making communities safe. These pressures go on year, and we can't meet those responsibilities with the level of grant funding that the government gives us.
Does it go back to austerity?
It goes back to austerity originally. If we go back 10 years, you remember local authorities had to go through a series of financial savings exercises, or cuts as most people call it, in order to balance the books at that time. We thought we'd got through that, but now it's back again. And of course, authorities now no longer have any low-hanging fruit. There are not easy changes to make. They've been lean and mean for the last 5 to 10 years. We then get the latest picture where massive demand is outstripping the resources available, and it's inevitable we will see more 114 notices issued in the months and years ahead, as we've seen from the survey of our members.
But let's talk about the investment decisions of local councils. How much do their choices on where to put the money actually have a bearing on future bankruptcy filings?
Well, it depends what you mean by investment. There are two sides to local authority budgets. One is a capital investment side, which we all do. We borrow money to fix the roads. We borrow money to build new houses. We borrow money for new plant and equipment to keep services going. And then there's obviously the revenue investment into services themselves. We've seen some local authorities, but they are very few, who've got into investment difficulties trying to find ways and means of avoiding some of these substantial savings that we have to make. And clearly, they have to take some responsibility for that. But when we look at places like Birmingham or Nottingham and indeed Kirklees and others, these are being caused by that substantial pressure on those revenue budgets from service demand, but also by a grant system that's not working. First of all, the grant that's coming through isn't enough to meet that demand. But secondly, the distribution of that grant by government has also changed dramatically in the last 10 years. We used to have a system that public services received grant on the basis of the needs of the area. What the government's done in the last 10 years is start to move away from a needs-based approach to one of economic growth and prosperity. So inevitably what's been happening is poorer areas that don't have the growth have seen their money taken away and given to more prosperous areas that do have the economic growth. You'll remember Rishi Sunak, when he was standing for election as party leader, said, "I've changed the formulas to move the money into your areas." Well, what that's done, basically, is move money from the north and the Midlands into the south of England. So we've got, one, not enough money, but two, distribution, which simply isn't fair.
Yeah, and I suspect the government would push back on that and say, look, that they're, levelling up agenda, although they don't use that terminology quite so much anymore, that they would say that they are trying to, bring areas up across the country and that they're not focused on doing that it isn't sort of party political. That would, I suspect, be their defence. But look, your organisation, you're meant to be a collective voice. You're a campaigning organisation, and you talk about wanting to secure sufficient, sustainable and fair funding. So this must surely, in your mind, go back to government, why is government not listening in terms of the funding needs from councils? And does it also simply mean that the council tax is going to have to continue to be raised significantly across the country?
I think we will see council tax rising significantly. Now it's capped, so the levels we can go to are again determined by the government, but most local authorities have a bit more flexibility on council tax to try and deal with adult social care. The problem with council tax is we all have very different council tax bases, and so the ability to raise money through council tax varies wildly across the country, and it's no long-term solution. This does go back to government and enough money in the system. We've just got to be honest about that and say government can't say to us, keep children safe, fund all those adult needs, but by the way, there's no more money to do it. No, there's got to be a recognition of the scale of this.
Yes.
And this is cross-party.
But
This
hang
isn't
on.
just Labour or Conservative or whatever.
Sure.
Everyone is saying the same thing.
But councils must also take responsibility for the failed types of investments that they've gone to in that sort of desperate move to try to make, the pounds go further. There have been some disastrous issues with councils putting in money into complex investment structures to try to make the money go further. I mean, that's surely a failure of devolution, of giving councils too much power in some ways to make very, very difficult financial decisions about budgets.
There are a handful of councils who've done that, and you're quite right, they need to take responsibility for what they've done. But what we're seeing now is way beyond that. We're looking at local authorities who have proud and strong records of good financial management across the country saying to us, we can't go on like this. And if the settlement next year doesn't improve, what you will see this time next year, October, November next year, is a lot more councils, places that have had the highest respect, not just in their local communities, but across the country, that will be looking at the kind of things we are seeing today. So what we mustn't do is tarnish the whole sector by the poor management of one or two. We've got to look at this in the round, and in the round, the sector is as one, both politically, geographically. Everyone is saying the same thing. Can they all be wrong?
But as people are seeing more of these bankruptcies, do you worry about the future of devolution?
Of course. In the end, our first responsibility is to provide good local services. And if we can't manage to do that, then devolution, doing other things, as exciting as and interesting as that might be, pales into insignificance. Our job, first and foremost, protect children, look after older people, make sure we can do those basic services that people want in their communities. That's the platform for devolution. So there's got to be enough money in the system to allow us to do that before we start saying, well, we'll do all these other great things, which no doubt we would like to do, but that foundation has got to be in the right place.
Councillor Stephen Houghton, thank you so much for being with us. Hope you'll come back onto Bloomberg Radio, talk to us about what happens next in Nottingham City after that Section 114 notice. Stephen Houghton, Chair of the Special Interest Group of Municipal Authorities.
Now, just in April this year, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, announced 3 brand new members of the Economic Advisory Council. The group was set up to provide independent, expert advice on economic policy to grow the economy. But this month, it was disbanded, just over a year after it was first established. Well, we spoke to one of those 3 new members, Dr. Anna Valero, on Bloomberg Radio, and we asked her why the council is no more. Here's her answer.
The fact is that economists and experts are constantly providing their analysis and advice to government, to civil servants, and I hope that I can continue doing the same based on the academic research that we conduct.
So that was Dr. Anna Valero, which begs the question, what happened to the Chancellor's trusted advisers? Bloomberg's Philip Aldrick learned earlier this year that the majority of them were worried the Bank of England was going too far raising rates. Did that have something to do with their axing? Phil joins us now on the line. Phil, had the best minds in markets become a liability?
I don't think so. They certainly hadn't become a liability. And yeah, the position they took earlier in the year in terms of this advice they were giving the Chancellor that rate rises had gone far enough turned out to have been the right advice. And obviously now the bank has paused the rate hikes. The general conversation internationally is widely that we've hit the top of Table Mountain and we're going to come down the other side at some point, but not for a while. So I don't think they've been a liability. I think the Chancellor basically, I mean, the way the Treasury thinks about it is that these great economic minds were brought in after the sort of trust debacle to stabilize the market crisis that came out of the mini budget back in September 2022, and they believe that effectively that sort of stabilization has worked. You've seen, you're not seeing a particular sort of wedge between our sort of government borrowing costs and other European countries' borrowing costs. So okay. I mean, there's not been that sort of stabilization has happened. So they can argue that the job has been done.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So that these advisors have helped, and that they're moving forwards. I love this sort of story, Phil. I got to say it, because we so often talk about the announcements of government and the new initiatives, and we hardly ever, it seems in the main, go back over what they've actually done and when it gets disbanded. I mean, surely this, though, one could argue, is a moment that the Chancellor still does desperately need advisors. I mean, it's only been, as you say, a year. Valero's specialism is in economic growth, and that's what everyone is talking about the UK needing.
Yeah, so they absolutely do need to be taking advice, and the Treasury the Chancellor is still taking advice. It's not as clear who he's taking the advice from now. I mean, he's definitely having these regular meetings with Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England. He's got, Sam Beckett, who used to be, senior statistician in the UK, and now she's the chief economist at the Treasury. He's got his internal advisor, Adam Menon, but he's also they're making sure that he is speaking to business and other economic experts on a sort of regular basis. That's how I understand it. So I mean, you remember, obviously Hunt does need to take advice. He's not a trained economist. He's relatively new to the job and thrust into a crisis. So I mean, I'm sure he's definitely using what expertise he can find.
I mean, a few members of the council were ex-Bank of England, Sushil Wadhwani, Gertrude Vlieger. Do you think that not having them made a difference to the autumn statement? Of course, the focus was cutting taxes. Do you think that those members would have condoned that when you've still got inflation above twice the Bank of England's target?
So the fiscal position is a little bit more complicated, because obviously the Chancellor did announce a massive tax cut for national insurance, which comes in about 6 weeks' time, but that is more than offset by the threshold freezes. So actually they're taking more tax. So the OECD did say this week that actually the fiscal position that the UK is taking is tightening, and it does work. It is still working with the Bank of England to bear down on inflation. So despite that tax cut, there is fiscal consolidation happening. So that is taking money out of the economy, fixing the public finances and reducing borrowing. So there isn't a stimulus. So it's not like that disastrous mini budget. The policy objectives are still aligned to get inflation down. So that is the OECD's judgment. I wouldn't say that these guys would. I don't think they would be saying that there's been some catastrophic error. I mean, remember the way that this worked was it was very much a one-way conversation. So the experts would come into the room, they would tell the Chancellor all the things which are difficult, need to be dealt with, what business wants, what markets need, etc. And they didn't get much back, because obviously the Chancellor was very conscious that these people could actually then talk about what the government's policies would be. So they didn't want like leaks coming out of this council. So this was this was a sort of we're in listening mode within the Treasury, and I guess what they're doing is that they're still in listening mode, but just with a less official bunch of people, because they don't feel like they need to have this sort of overarching economic committee now that markets have effectively stabilised. And let's hope that they stay that way.
Yeah, that's what I heard, Phil, as well. Whenever I was trying to wheedle out of them what the Chancellor was really thinking, they said it was a one-way conversation. But look, the reason that we had Dr. Valero on the radio was primarily to talk about this productivity report that economists and academics like Diane Coyle at University of Cambridge, trade union members as well, policymakers, have called for this statutory body to oversee productivity growth. You've had the Economic Council that we were just talking about abandoned. I'm constantly hearing that the Office for Budget Responsibility and the Office for National Statistics are understaffed. So is there really an appetite? Are there really the resources to create a whole new statutory body on productivity?
Well, they find the resources if they want to do it. If they want to do it enough. I don't get the impression that there is any desire to set up a separate statutory body. There was the Office for Tax Simplification, which they've taken. Well, Kwasi Kwarteng, obviously, in his brief stint as Chancellor, decided to disband, and Hunt and Sunak continued with that, and they brought that in-house. I guess they feel that the Treasury, and there's sort of independent groups like Anna Valero's and Bart van Ark's, another economist who's very focused on productivity. They're doing a lot of work on this. So I don't know whether it's necessary to have a productivity institute, but there used to be an Industrial Strategy Council. And that was disbanded as well. That was Andy Haldane. Of course, he then rejoined as one of the economic advisors. And just on the economic advisors, one small complication was Rupert Harrison was on that economic advisory committee. He's now standing to be a Tory MP. So there were ways in which it looked as though there were sort of potential biases on that committee. But there are the Industrial Strategy Council. There are reasons to have these productivity groups, these industrial strategy councils, but you can see clearly that this government doesn't really want these to be interfering. They're more free marketeers than Labour on that front, whereas Labour would have some kind of Industrial Strategy Council or some productivity group. This government wants to sort of let the market sorted out, as the Chancellor said in his speech. They don't want to be a big government. They want to step back and let the private sector deal with these things as they would.
Okay, Phil, thank you so much. The inner workings then of government, how they think about economics, who advises them, it begs Phil Aldrick.
Well, back to Dubai now for COP28. It's set to be the biggest discussion yet of how to prevent an environmental catastrophe in the hottest year on record. We're joined now by Bloomberg's political correspondent, Ellen Milligan. Ellen, what's the UK government putting on the table in Dubai?
Well, Sunak is flying there to be there for about 12 hours tomorrow in Dubai. I'm one of the press pack going with him. He's yet to make announcements, but we did reveal in our own reporting that the UK is expected to pledge money for this loss and damage fund.
What's that?
It's money that more developed nations, more rich nations put for islands, for smaller developing nations who have really suffered damage because of rising temperatures, because of disruptive weather due to the climate. So it helps mitigate those and repair some of that damage done. It's kind of like a compensation for the loss that they've suffered. We're also expecting just under £500 million pledged by the UK to go towards rainforests and forestry. And there will also be some announcements on climate finance, potentially a UK-Canada summit next year on phasing away from coal. And also a pledge between the US, Canada, Japan, France and the UK on nuclear fuel. So lots of tidbits here and there. But definitely the kind of big headlines will be about loss and damage and climate finance, and the focus on the UK going big on being the hotspot for carbon markets.
Although, of course, there's still a debate around loss and damage, whether it's voluntary contributions or whether those voluntary contributions get turned into something more compulsory. Ellen, what about Labour's offer? We were just talking about Keir Starmer being in Dubai.
Yeah, there's this odd tussle that's been happening really for about a year between Sunak and Starmer on who attracts most interest from business leaders, lobbyists, I guess green groups, green firms as well. And you've really seen that kind of become much more visible this past week. The Global Investment Summit, the breakfast that Starmer and Reeves held with big banks like JP Morgan at Sunak's own investment summit, the debacle over the Elgin marbles, and actually Starmer being the one to have the bilat with the Greek Prime Minister to talk about UK-Greek cooperation. And I think you're going to see that again at COP. You'll see these counter announcements from the government and from Labour about potentially like climate finance, loss and damage, renewables. Labour will go big on their green energy plan. And they'll also probably be talking a lot about Labour being able to attract new investment into the renewables sector. And also Starmer's going for quite a bit longer than Sunak is. So there's that as well.
All right, Ellen Milligan, have a safe flight to Dubai. Good luck. Thanks for bringing us the latest. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Marufal Hussain. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.